My name is Renee Kowalski, and I'm 33 years old. 3 weeks ago, I stood in the back room of a pawn shop on Route 9, holding a photograph of my mother, the one where she's laughing at her own 40th birthday party, with her wedding ring catching the light, and a gold bracelet I used to twist around my fingers as a little girl. The man behind the counter looked at the photo, looked at me, and then very quietly slid a ledger across the glass case. My hands were steady when I opened it. They are always steady. That is the one thing my job has given me that nothing else in my life ever could. But steady hands did not stop my stomach from dropping straight through the floor when I saw the date, the description, and the name signed at the bottom of that entry. It was not a stranger's name, it was my stepfather's. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I do not believe in scenes. I do not believe in screaming in parking lots or throwing accusations across a dinner table before you have the facts lined up clean in front of you. I am an insurance claims investigator. I spend my days proving what happened to things people lost, whether it was a house fire, or a stolen car, or a diamond that mysteriously vanished the same week someone filed for bankruptcy. I know how to read a paper trail the way other people read a room. And that Tuesday afternoon, standing under the fluorescent lights of a pawn shop 2 towns over, from where I grew up, I read a paper trail that told me exactly how my mother's jewelry, every single piece of it, had ended up in the hands of strangers who were owed money by a man who had promised me, that he would keep it safe forever. Here is where I have to slow down and tell you what those pieces actually were, because to anyone else they were just jewelry. To me, they were the only physical proof left that my mother had existed at all. There was her wedding band, plain gold, nothing fancy, bought the year she and my father got married before he passed, when I was 9. There was a strand of pearls that had belonged to her own mother, my grandmother, who crossed an ocean with almost nothing except those pearls sewn into the lining of a coat. And there was a bracelet, an emerald and gold bracelet my mother bought for herself the year her small bakery finally turned a profit after 4 years of scraping by on flour and hope and 14-hour days. She used to say that the bracelet was proof that a woman could build something out of nothing if she refused to quit. She wore it every single day until the cancer took the weight off her wrist so badly that it kept sliding down over her knuckles, and even then she would not take it off. When she died, I was 28. I sat beside her hospital bed and held that same wrist, the one wearing that same bracelet, and she told me in a voice that had gone thin as paper that the jewelry was mine, all of it. She had said it to me many times over the years, but that was the last time, and it was the time that mattered most, because 3 days later she was gone, and the man she had married 9 years earlier, the man everyone called a good stepfather, the man who cried at her funeral louder than anyone in that church, became the one holding the keys to the house where that jewelry box sat locked in a drawer of her old dresser. I trusted him. That is the part that still makes my chest go tight when I think about it. I trusted him because I had no reason not to, and because grief makes you want to believe the people around you are exactly who they appear to be. For a long time after she passed, I did not ask about the jewelry box. That is not a weakness. That is what mourning does to a person. You do not walk into your dead mother's bedroom and start cataloging her belongings like an auditor. You give the house, the man who lives in it, and yourself room to breathe. I told myself there would be time. I told myself the ring and the pearls and the bracelet were sitting exactly where they had always sat, safe, untouched, waiting for the day I was ready to hold them again without falling apart. I had no idea that while I was giving everyone that grace, a debt was quietly growing in a house I no longer lived in. A debt owed not to a bank or a credit card company, but to men who do not send polite letters when payment is late. I had no idea that the only thing standing between my stepfather and those men was a jewelry box that legally, morally, and in every way that mattered was never his to touch. I found out the truth on an ordinary Tuesday because of an ordinary reason. My daughter turned 4 that spring, and I wanted more than anything to put my mother's pearls around her tiny neck just once for the photographs, the way my own mother had done with me when I was small, standing in front of the same hallway mirror in the same house. I called my stepfather Gary and asked him sweetly, the way you ask a favor from someone you still want to believe is family, if I could stop by and get the box out of the dresser. There was a pause on the line that lasted just a beat too long. Then he said, Sure, come on by," in a voice that sounded like a man rehearsing a line he had been dreading for years. I remember hanging up the phone and standing in my kitchen thinking that pause meant nothing. I was wrong about a great many things that season, but I was never more wrong than that. Before I tell you what I found in that dresser drawer, and what it led me to uncover about strangers showing up at my mother's house, about a debt with a number attached to it that made my ears ring, and about exactly how far a grieving widower will go to protect himself instead of the memory of the woman he buried, I want to ask you something. If you have ever lost someone and had to trust another person to protect what little was left of them, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one, and this story, I promise you, is going to need you with me all the way to the end. Hit subscribe if you have not already, because what I found in that pawn shop ledger was only the beginning, and what I did after I closed that ledger is the reason my stepfather has not slept peacefully in 3 weeks. Let me take you back now, back before the ledger, back before the pawn shop, back to the house where I grew up, and the woman who filled it with the kind of warmth you only understand you have lost once it is gone. Let me take you back to the year everything in my family, quietly, carefully, started coming apart, long before anyone but me noticed it was happening at all. My mother's name was Diane Kowalski, though for the first 32 years of her life she was Diane Marsh, a name she used to say sounded like something out of a black and white film. She grew up in a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Scranton, with a mother who spoke broken English and a father who worked the night shift at a steel plant until his hands were more scar tissue than skin. Diane was the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgave most of it, the kind who could walk into a room and know within 30 seconds who needed a cup of coffee and who needed to be left alone. She met my father, Michael, at a diner where she worked the counter through nursing school, and by all accounts, the two of them built a small, steady, unremarkable happiness together. I was born when she was 26. My father died of a heart attack when I was 9, standing in our garage on an ordinary Saturday morning with a wrench in his hand, and just like that, my mother became a widow with a 9-year-old daughter and a mortgage she had never expected to carry alone. She did not fall apart the way people sometimes imagine widows falling apart in movies. She got quieter for a while, yes, and there were nights I heard her crying through the wall in a way she thought I could not hear. But within a year, she had gone back to school for a certification in pastry arts, something she had always wanted to do, and never had the nerve to try while my father was alive, because he liked things steady, and she loved him enough to keep them that way. After he was gone, she opened a small bakery on the corner of Ashford and 9th, a shoebox of a place with 4 tables and a case that never had quite enough room for everything she wanted to bake. She named it Sweet Diane's, which embarrassed me terribly as a preteen, and which I would give almost anything to see the sign for again now. It took 4 years of debt, and 14-hour days, and a lot of nights where dinner was whatever unsold from the case, but by the time I was 16, that bakery was profitable, and my mother bought herself that emerald and gold bracelet with the very first real profit she ever pulled from it, because she wanted, in her words, a piece of proof she could wear on her wrist that she had built something with her own 2 hands. She met Gary Fenwick when I was 19, 3 years after she opened the bakery, and a full decade after my father died. Gary was a contractor. Big laugh, big hands, the kind of man who fixed your porch steps without being asked, and then made a joke about it so you would not feel like you owed him anything. He was 51 when they met, divorced once already, no kids of his own, and he came into my mother's bakery every Tuesday morning for a black coffee and a cinnamon roll, until one Tuesday he asked her to dinner instead. I want to be honest with you because honesty is the whole point of telling this story, right? I liked Gary in those early years. He made my mother laugh in a way I had not heard since before my father died. He came to my college graduation and cried. Actually cried, standing in the third row in a rented cap and gown of his own borrowed pride. When he married my mother 2 years later in a small ceremony in the backyard of the house they bought together, I stood up as one of her witnesses, and I meant every word I said about being happy for her. For years, that marriage looked exactly like what everyone hoped it would be. Gary helped her expand the bakery into a second location. He drove her to appointments when her knees started giving her trouble. He learned, slowly and clumsily, how to be present in a way I think surprised even him. But there was one thing about Gary that I noticed early, and dismissed for far too long. The way you dismiss a hairline crack in a foundation, because the house is still standing, and the roof still holds. Gary gambled. Not in the dramatic, obvious way you might picture, not disappearing for days or losing the mortgage payment in one reckless night. It was quieter than that. A weekend trip to Atlantic City here. A regular Thursday night poker game with men from his old construction crew there. A lottery habit that ate into his paycheck in small, steady, forgettable amounts. My mother mentioned it to me exactly twice in all the years she was married to him, both times in the careful, downplaying voice of a woman who has decided a small flaw is a fair price for an otherwise good man. He blows off steam, she told me once. Every man needs something. I did not push. I regret that more than almost anything else in this story. The cancer came for her when she was 58, ovarian, caught later than anyone wanted because she had spent so many years putting other people's needs ahead of her own annual checkups. I was 28, married by then to my husband Danny, working long hours at the insurance firm where I had just made investigator. I drove the 2 hours to see her every single weekend for the 18 months of her treatment, sitting with her through chemo, watching the bracelet slide looser and looser on a wrist that was disappearing in front of me. Gary was there too, to his credit, driving her to appointments, sleeping in the recliner beside her hospital bed, more nights than I can count. I want you to understand that I am not telling you he was a monster from the beginning. I am telling you he was a man with a crack in his foundation, and grief and stress and fear are exactly the kind of weather that turns a hairline crack into something that swallows a house whole. In the final weeks, my mother started talking about the jewelry more than she ever had before. The way people sometimes start putting their affairs in order, once they understand, really understand, that time is running out. She told me the wedding ring was mine. She told me the pearls, her own mother's pearls, sewn once into the lining of a coat that crossed an ocean, were mine. She told me the emerald bracelet, the one she bought with her own money the year her bakery finally worked, was mine most of all, because she wanted me to remember, whenever my own life felt impossible, that she had built something out of nothing, and so could I. She said all of this with Gary standing right there in the room, and Gary nodded along and said, "Of course, Diane, whatever you want," in a voice that I now understand, looking back, already had a fault line running through it. 3 days after that conversation, on a gray Tuesday morning in March, my mother died holding my hand, and the world I had known my entire life, quietly, permanently, rearranged itself around her absence. At the funeral, Gary cried louder than anyone in that church, and I held him afterwards in the receiving line, the way you hold family, because in every legal and practical sense, that is exactly what he still was. I had no idea, standing in that church in my black dress with my mother's pearls sitting untouched in a dresser drawer 2 miles away, that the man crying beside me was already carrying a weight of debt he had not told a single person about, a weight that would, within a handful of years, come looking for something to pay itself off with. I had no idea that the jewelry box I trusted him to protect was about to become the only thing standing between him and men who do not send polite letters when the money does not come. For the first year after my mother died, the house on Ashford Street stayed exactly the way it had always been, Or at least, that is what I told myself every time I visited. Gary kept her reading glasses on the side table by the couch. He kept her coat on the hook by the back door, long after any reasonable person would have donated it. He kept the bakery running for almost 8 months before finally selling it to one of her longtime employees, a sweet woman named Carol, who had worked the counter for 12 years and who cried when she signed the papers because, she told me later, it felt like burying Diane a second time. I remember being grateful to Gary during that stretch. I remember thinking that whatever cracks I had noticed in him over the years, whatever quiet gambling habit my mother had waved off as a man blowing off steam, none of it mattered as much as the fact that he seemed genuinely, deeply lost without her. Grief does strange things to a person's judgment, and mine was no exception. I gave him the benefit of every doubt I had. I had moved out of state by then, Danny and I settling 2 hours away for his job, and I was pregnant with our daughter within that first year, which meant my visits home became fewer and further between than I would have liked. I told myself distance was normal. I told myself Gary was an adult who did not need me checking in on him the way you check in on a child. But there were things, small things at first, that started to feel off in a way I could not quite name. My Aunt Sherry, my mother's younger sister, called me one evening, about 1.5 years after the funeral, and mentioned, almost in passing, that she had seen Gary's truck parked outside the tribal casino, 2 counties over, on a Tuesday afternoon, when he should have been at work. I laughed it off. Everybody needs a hobby, I told her, echoing my mother's own words back to her, without even realizing I was doing it. Sherry did not laugh. She just went quiet on the other end of the line, in a way that should have told me more than it did. Then there was the matter of the house itself. Gary had always been good with money, in the way a contractor tends to be, careful with materials, careful with labor costs, careful with the mortgage that he and my mother had paid down steadily for years. But sometime around the 2-year mark after her death, small cracks started showing there too. He mentioned once, during a phone call, that he was thinking about refinancing, just to free up some cash for a few projects around the house. I did not think much of it at the time. Homeowners refinance all the time for perfectly ordinary reasons. What I did not know, what I would not learn until much later, was that the refinance he took out was significantly larger than any reasonable renovation could have justified, and that within 8 months of pulling that money out of the equity my mother had spent a decade building, most of it had already disappeared into accounts and transactions I would only later be able to trace with the same skills I use every single day at my job. My half-sister Kelsey, Gary's daughter from his first marriage, was another piece of this puzzle that I did not fully appreciate until much later. Kelsey was 24 when my mother died, a sweet if somewhat aimless young woman who had never quite found her footing, bouncing between jobs and boyfriends, and a series of half-started plans. Gary had always been generous with her, more generous, if I am honest, than he ever needed to be, covering rent when she fell behind, buying her a used car when hers broke down, quietly slipping her cash whenever she asked. My mother used to mention this to me sometimes, with a small, tired sigh. Not resentful exactly, just tired in the way you get tired watching someone you love make the same soft mistake over and over. After Diane died, that generosity toward Kelsey did not slow down. If anything, it seemed to accelerate, as though Gary was trying to fill some hole in himself by pouring money into his daughter that he could not pour into anything else. I noticed this. I did not connect it to anything at the time. I filed it away the way you file away a strange smell in a house, unpleasant, but not urgent enough to investigate. The real warning sign, the one I still think about with a kind of low, simmering anger at myself for not acting on sooner, came from Carol, the woman who had bought my mother's bakery. I ran into her at a wedding back in our hometown almost 2 years after my mother passed, and after a few glasses of wine, she pulled me aside with the particular carefulness of a woman who has been debating whether to say something for a long time. She told me that Gary had come by the bakery a few months earlier, not to visit, but to ask if she needed any part-time help, specifically evening and weekend shifts, the kind of shifts that suggested a man trying to pick up extra cash on the side of whatever he was already doing. Carol had thought it was strange, a man his age, semi-retired from contracting, suddenly wanting to bus tables and work a register for minimum wage plus tips. She had turned him down gently, and he had laughed it off, said he was just bored, just missing Diane's old place, and Carol had let it go because what else was she supposed to do? But she told me that night at the wedding, with a look on her face like she was finally setting down something heavy she had been carrying, that it had not felt like boredom to her. It had felt, she said carefully, like a man who needed money and did not want anyone to know why. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. I did hear these things. I did notice the pauses on phone calls, the casino sighting, the strange refinance, Kelsey's endless soft landings, Carol's uneasy story at that wedding. But I was building my own life at the same time, sleepless with a newborn, exhausted from work, grieving my mother in the slow, uneven way grief actually happens, rather than the neat, contained way people expect it to. I told myself, over and over, that Gary was allowed to be a flawed man without being a dangerous one. I told myself that whatever quiet financial trouble he might be in was his own business to sort out, that it had nothing to do with me, that it certainly had nothing to do with a locked dresser drawer 2 hours away, holding a wedding ring, a strand of pearls, and an emerald bracelet that my mother had put directly into my hands with her dying breath. I did not yet understand that a man drowning in debt does not see a locked drawer as someone else's inheritance. He sees it as the only lifeboat left in the house, and he will eventually, quietly, desperately, reach for it, no matter whose name was ever attached to it. My daughter Willow turned 4 years old on the second Saturday in March, 3 years and 11 months after my mother died, and I wanted, more than I had wanted almost anything in a long time, to see her wearing my grandmother's pearls for the birthday photographs the way I had worn them at that same age, standing in front of that same hallway mirror in that same house on Ashford Street. It felt important in a way I could not fully explain to Danny, some thread I needed to pull taut between 3 generations of women in my family, before it frayed any further. I called Gary on a Wednesday evening in early March, my voice light and easy, the voice of a daughter who still believed she had nothing to worry about. I asked if I could stop by that weekend, just to grab my mother's jewelry box out of the dresser, just for the photos. I would bring it right back if he wanted, though of course we both knew it was mine to keep. There was a pause on the line. I told you about that pause already. I did not understand its weight at the time, but I have replayed it in my mind so many times since that I could probably transcribe the exact length of the silence down to the second. Sure, Gary finally said. Sure. Come on by. His voice had a strange, over-rehearsed quality to it, like a man reading lines he had practiced in a mirror and still could not quite make sound natural. I drove the 2 hours that Saturday, with Willow strapped into her car seat, singing along to the radio, completely unaware that I was driving toward the worst afternoon of my adult life. Gary met me at the door with a hug that lasted a beat too long, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that he was just emotional about the anniversary approaching, about seeing Willow grow, about the ordinary weight of missing my mother on an ordinary Saturday. He made small talk in the kitchen, while I let Willow run around the backyard where my mother used to grow tomatoes, and then, when I finally asked to head upstairs to the bedroom, he got very quiet and told me he needed to talk to me about something first. I sat down at that same kitchen table where my mother used to roll out pie crust on Sunday afternoons, and Gary sat across from me with his big contractor hands wrapped around a coffee mug he was not drinking from, and he told me, in halting, broken pieces, that the jewelry was gone. I want to describe exactly what that moment felt like, because I think it matters for you to understand it, the way I actually experienced it, rather than the way I might have imagined it in advance. It did not feel like anger at first. It felt like the floor of the kitchen was tilting slightly beneath my chair, like the air in the room had suddenly gotten thinner. "Gone," I repeated back to him, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, The way my voice always comes out steady even when everything underneath it is shaking. Gone where, Gary? He would not look at me directly. He looked at the coffee mug instead, turning it slowly in his hands, and he told me a story about a break-in, about coming home one evening to find a window cracked open and some things missing from around the house. Some cash, some tools from the garage, and yes, unfortunately, the jewelry box from Diane's dresser. He said he had filed a police report. He said he had meant to tell me sooner, but did not know how, did not want to hurt me on top of everything else I had already lost. He said all of this with the particular fluency of a man who has told the same story enough times to himself that it has started to sound almost true even in his own ears. I did not argue with him that day. I want you to understand that about me, because I think it explains everything that came after. I am not a woman who screams across a kitchen table. I have built an entire career out of the discipline of staying calm while everything around me is on fire, because the moment you let your emotions run the investigation, you lose the thread of the facts. So I nodded. I asked him gently for the police report number, just for my own records, I told him, just so I could follow up in case anything ever turned up at a pawn shop somewhere. He hesitated again, that same overlong pause, and then said he would have to look for it, that it was somewhere in his files, that he would send it to me. I drove home that afternoon with Willow asleep in her car seat, and I sat with a strange, cold clarity settling into my chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the particular instinct you develop after years of investigating claims for a living. I have interviewed hundreds of people who were lying to me about a loss. I know exactly what it sounds like. And Gary, sitting at that kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cold coffee mug, had sounded exactly like every single one of them. It took me 4 days to find the report he claimed he had filed, and I found it the way I find everything, methodically, patiently, refusing to let my anger get ahead of my facts. There was no police report. I called the local station myself, gave them the address, gave them the approximate date range, and the officer on the phone told me, with the particular flatness of someone reading directly off a screen, that no burglary or break-in had ever been reported at that address in the past 4 years. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my office for almost 20 minutes after that call, staring straight ahead, feeling something in me go very quiet and very still, the way I imagine the eye of a storm must feel from the inside. My stepfather had not been robbed. My stepfather had lied to my face at my dead mother's kitchen table, holding a coffee mug he never drank from, and I intended to find out exactly why, and exactly where, every single piece of that jewelry had actually gone. The pawn shop was the third one I tried, a place called Route 9 Golden Loan, 40 minutes outside the town where Gary lived, far enough away that he had clearly hoped no one who knew him would ever walk through that door and ask questions. I did not walk in as his daughter that day. I walked in the way I walk into every investigation, calm, professional, holding a photograph and a description detailed enough that the man behind the counter did not even hesitate before pulling out his ledger. It took him less than 2 minutes to find the entry. A wedding band, 14-karat gold. A strand of cultured pearls, appraised previously at just under $3,000, according to an old insurance document I had found buried in my mother's files years earlier. An emerald and gold bracelet, sold for a fraction of what it was actually worth, the way desperate men always sell things for far less than they should, because they need the cash today, and not next week. And at the bottom of that entry, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, because I had watched him sign birthday cards and mortgage papers and my own wedding guest book, was Gary's signature, dated 11 months earlier, alongside a driver's license number that matched exactly. I stood there, under those fluorescent lights, holding the photograph of my laughing mother in one hand and the proof of my stepfather's lie in the other, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its coldness, that I was no longer looking for the truth. I already had it. What I needed now was to find out exactly what desperation had driven a grieving widower to sell a dead woman's wedding ring to strangers, and exactly how much he owed them, and to whom. I did not call Gary that night, and I did not call him the next day either. I have learned, both from my job and from watching my own family fall apart in slow motion over the years, that the moment you confront a liar too early, you hand them time to build a better lie. So instead of picking up the phone, I sat down at my kitchen table after Willow had gone to bed, and I did what I do for a living. I built a file. I photographed the pawnshop ledger entry with the manager's permission, careful to note the date, the item descriptions, the sale price, and Gary's signature. I pulled the old insurance appraisal documents from a box in my closet, papers my mother had kept meticulously in a fireproof lockbox that I had inherited along with a stack of her recipe cards and old photographs, because Diane Kowalski never trusted anything valuable to memory alone. That appraisal, done nearly 6 years earlier for our homeowner's policy, valued the pearls at $2,800, the emerald bracelet at just over $4,000, and the wedding band, though modest, at a little over $600 given the weight of the gold. Altogether, a little more than $7,400 of jewelry that Gary had sold to strangers for a combined total, according to the pawnshop's own records, of only $2,900. That gap alone told me everything about the kind of hurry he had been in. The next thing I did was call my Aunt Sherry, the one who had mentioned Gary's truck parked outside the casino all those months earlier, and this time I did not brush past what she was telling me. "Sherry, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," I said, and I could hear her go very still on the other end of the line, the way people go still when they have been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask the right question. She told me everything then, all at once, like a dam finally giving way. She told me that in the 2 years since my mother died, she had heard from mutual friends that Gary had racked up debts at more than one casino along the eastern shore, and that more recently, in just the past several months, he had gotten involved in a private card game run out of the back room of a bar 2 towns over, the kind of game where the stakes climbed fast, and the men running it were not the type who sent polite invoices when a payment came due. Sherry told me she had heard, through a friend whose husband knew one of the men involved, that Gary owed somewhere close to $18,000, and that 2 men had shown up at his house on Ashford Street just a few months before I ever asked him for the jewelry box, standing on my mother's front porch in the evening light, having what a neighbor described as a very quiet, very tense conversation with him on the steps. I sat with that number for a long time after I hung up with Sherry. $18,000 is not a number that appears out of nowhere. It is not the kind of debt a man accumulates in a single bad night. It accumulates slowly, the way rot spreads through a foundation, one bad decision layered on top of another, until the whole structure is compromised, and nobody notices until the floor gives way beneath someone's feet. I thought about the refinance he had mentioned casually over the phone all those months ago, the one he claimed was for renovations. I thought about Carol at the bakery, turned away from a part-time job he never actually needed unless he was that desperate for extra cash on the side. I thought about Kelsey and the endless soft landings, and I began to wonder, with a coldness that surprised even me, whether some of that generosity toward her had actually been Gary funneling borrowed money through his daughter to cover his tracks, or whether it was simply one more symptom of a man who could not say no to anyone but himself. I called a friend of mine, a private investigator named Marcus Chen, whom I had worked alongside on insurance fraud cases for nearly 6 years, and I laid the whole thing out for him over coffee on a Thursday morning, sliding the pawnshop photographs and the old appraisal documents across the table the way I would for any other client. Marcus listened without interrupting, the way good investigators do, and when I finished, he asked me the one question that mattered most. "Renee," he said, "do you want to prove what he did, or do you want to get the jewelry back?" I told him honestly that I wanted both, but that I understood I might only be able to have one. Marcus spent the better part of the following week doing what he does best, quietly tracing the debt itself. He confirmed through a contact of his, a man who did legitimate collections work and occasionally crossed paths with the rougher side of that business, that Gary Fenwick did indeed owe a debt in the private card game Sherry had described, and that the two men who visited his porch that evening were not affiliated with any legitimate lending institution at all. They were private lenders in the truest, most dangerous sense of the word, men who did not file paperwork with any court and who solved unpaid debts with pressure rather than lawsuits. What Marcus found next was the piece that turned this from a painful family betrayal into something with actual legal teeth. Because my mother's estate had never been fully closed out on the jewelry specifically, the pieces having been distributed informally after her death, rather than through any formal probate transfer, Gary had, in effect, sold property that legally belonged to me, not to him, and not to their shared marital estate. My mother's will, which Marcus and I pulled together from the county courthouse records, stated explicitly and in writing that her personal jewelry was to pass directly to her daughter, meaning me, upon her death. Gary had never contested that clause. He had simply ignored it, treated the jewelry as though it were still sitting in a shared household where he had equal claim, and sold it to cover a debt that had absolutely nothing to do with me, or with the memory of the woman he had buried 3 years earlier. In the state where he lived, Marcus explained carefully, that was not simply a moral betrayal. That was theft, plain and documented, with a paper trail leading straight back to his own signature on a pawn shop ledger. I sat in my car outside Marcus's office for a long time after that meeting, holding a manila folder that had grown thick with photographs, appraisals, court records, and the quiet, damning testimony of a debt that traced back to men who did not send polite letters. I thought about my mother's hands, thin as paper in that hospital bed, telling me the jewelry was mine. I thought about Gary crying louder than anyone in that church, and I understood, sitting there in the quiet of my own car with the folder resting on my lap like something both fragile and immensely heavy, that I was no longer simply a grieving daughter trying to understand what had happened to her mother's belongings. I had become, without ever intending to, the one person in this family who held every single piece of proof required to make Gary Fenwick answer, in front of everyone who loved him, for exactly what he had done. The occasion presented itself before I even had to look for one, which felt, in a strange way, like something my mother herself might have arranged from wherever she was watching all of this unfold. Every year on the anniversary of her death, the extended family gathered at Aunt Sherry's house for what we had started calling, somewhat awkwardly, a remembrance dinner, a tradition that began the first March after she passed almost as an accident. A handful of us showing up at Sherry's table because none of us wanted to spend that particular day alone, and it had simply continued every year since. This year would be the 4th one, and it would fall exactly 1 month after I visit that pawn shop on Route 9. Gary always came to these dinners. He would sit at the head of the table where my mother used to sit when it was hosted at her own house, and he would tell the same stories about her every year. The cinnamon roll she made him the first Tuesday he walked into her bakery, the way she used to hum while she cooked. And every year I had sat there and let those stories wash over me like something warm and true. This year, I decided, would be different. I spent the 2 weeks before that dinner doing the slow, careful work of building a case, rather than a scene, because I have learned the hard way, both professionally and personally, that the moment you let anger drive the confrontation, you lose control of the outcome entirely. Marcus helped me organize everything into a single folder, the kind I could set on a table without a word, and let speak entirely for itself. Inside it was the appraisal document from 6 years earlier, the pawn shop ledger photograph with Gary's signature clearly visible, a printed copy of my mother's will with the clause about her personal jewelry highlighted in yellow, and a short, factual summary Marcus had drafted of the debt itself, the $18,000, the private card game, the 2 men who had stood on my mother's porch in the evening light having a conversation a neighbor 2 houses down still remembered clearly enough to describe in detail. I did not include anything designed to humiliate him for the sake of humiliation. Everything in that folder was true, documented, and traceable, because I wanted there to be no version of this where anyone in my family could later convince themselves I had exaggerated or misunderstood. I also made one more decision in those 2 weeks that I debated longer than anything else, which was whether to try to buy back at least one piece of the jewelry before the confrontation itself. I went back to Route 9 Gold and Loan on a Saturday, alone this time, and I asked the manager, the same man who had shown me the ledger a month earlier, whether the wedding band was still on the premises or whether it had already been resold to a customer. He checked a second, smaller ledger and told me, almost apologetically, that most of the pieces had already moved through, sold to buyers he had no way of tracing, but that the wedding band, being plain and unremarkable compared to the pearls and the emerald bracelet, was still sitting in a case near the back, unclaimed and unwanted by anyone looking for something flashier. I bought it back that afternoon for $210, a number that felt almost obscene given what that ring actually meant, and I drove home with it sitting in a small velvet pouch on my passenger seat, unable to stop glancing over at it every few minutes, as though it might disappear again if I looked away too long. I told Danny everything during those 2 weeks, every piece of it, the pawn shop, the debt, the will, the ring sitting now in a drawer in our own bedroom instead of a stranger's display case. He listened the way he always listens, quietly and completely, and when I finished, he asked me the only question that mattered. "What do you need from me?" he asked, and I told him I needed him to come to that dinner and simply be present, not to say anything on my behalf, not to defend me or attack Gary, just to be there in case I needed to look at one steady face in a room that was about to become very unsteady for everyone in it. He agreed without hesitation. I also called Aunt Sherry the week before the dinner and told her, gently but clearly, that I intended to bring something up at the table this year, and that I wanted her to know in advance so she was not blindsided in her own home. Sherry, to her credit, did not ask me to reconsider or to wait for a better time. She simply asked if I was certain, and when I told her I was, she said only one thing back to me. "It's about time somebody was, Renee. Your mother deserved better than his stories." The night before the dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with the folder closed in front of me and the velvet pouch holding my mother's ring resting beside it, and I thought about the version of Gary who had cried louder than anyone in that church, the version who had driven my mother to appointments and slept in that recliner beside her hospital bed for months without complaint. I did not hate that man, and in some strange way, I never fully stopped believing he had loved her. But I understood, sitting there in the quiet of my own kitchen, with the evidence of his betrayal spread out in front of me, like something both fragile and undeniable, that loving someone does not excuse what he had done after she was gone. He had a choice, standing in front of that dresser drawer with a debt collector's shadow falling across his porch, and he chose to sell the only physical proof his wife had ever existed, rather than find any other way through his own desperation. Whatever compassion I still carried for the grieving man in that church pew, I understood I could no longer let it protect the man who had lied to my face across my mother's own kitchen table. I packed the folder and the velvet pouch into my bag that night and set it by the front door so I would not forget it in the morning, the way you might set out a coat or an umbrella before a long drive. Willow was already asleep down the hall, 4 years old and entirely unaware that her mother was about to walk into a room full of family the next evening and lay out, calmly and without raising her voice once, exactly what her step-grandfather had done to the memory of the woman who raised her mother. I thought about my mother's voice from that hospital bed, thin as paper, telling me the jewelry was mine, and I understood that what I was about to do the next day was not really about the money, or even about the ring now sitting safely in a velvet pouch in my own bedroom. It was about making sure that the last true thing my mother ever asked of me, the simple, quiet act of protecting what little she had left to give, was finally, after 4 long years, going to be honored the way it always should have been. Aunt Sherry's dining room looked exactly the way it always did on the anniversary of my mother's death. The good tablecloth pulled out of the linen closet, a small framed photograph of Diane set in the center of the table, surrounded by a few candles that nobody ever bothered to light because we all knew Sherry was terrified of setting the tablecloth on fire. There were 9 of us that evening, Sherry and her husband, my cousin Melissa and her boyfriend, Kelsey, sitting near her father the way she always did, Gary at what had become his customary spot at the head of the table, and Danny and me across from Sherry, with the folder resting quietly in my bag on the floor beside my chair. Gary looked older than I remembered him looking, even a month earlier, the stress of the last several years finally starting to show in the gray under his eyes, and the way his hands moved just a little too much when he talked, reaching for his water glass more often than a man usually needs to. He told the cinnamon roll story again that night, almost exactly word for word the way he had told it every year since my mother died, and everyone at the table laughed in the same soft, practiced way we always did, myself included, because some habits are hard to break even when you already know everything you know. I waited until dessert had been cleared, and the conversation had settled into that comfortable lull that happens near the end of a family dinner, when people start checking their phones, and someone mentions how late it is getting. I reached down and pulled the folder out of my bag, setting it on the table in front of me without a word, and I watched Gary's eyes flick toward it the way a man's eyes flick toward a car alarm going off 2 streets away, aware something is wrong before he can name exactly what. I asked Sherry gently if I could say something before everyone left, and she nodded and reached over to squeeze my hand once under the table, a small gesture that told me she already knew what was coming and had made peace with it happening in her own dining room. "I want to talk about Mom's jewelry," I said, and I kept my voice level and quiet, the same voice I use when I am reading a claim back to a client who has just been caught in a lie they did not expect anyone to notice. Gary's face did something complicated in that moment, a flicker of practiced concern layered over something colder underneath, and he said, almost too quickly, that he had told me already, "Honey, it was stolen, there was a break-in." He had felt terrible about it for years. I let him finish. I have learned that letting someone finish their lie in full is often more damning than interrupting them halfway through, because a complete lie leaves more room for the truth to dismantle every single piece of it. I opened the folder and slid the first document across the table toward him, the photograph of the pawn shop ledger, with his signature clearly visible beside the description of my mother's wedding band. "There was no break-in, Gary," I said quietly. "There's no police report because you never filed one. I called the station myself. What actually happened is that you walked into Route 9 Gold and Loan 11 months ago, and you sold Mom's wedding ring, her pearls, and her bracelet to strangers for less than half of what they were worth, because you needed cash fast. And you needed it fast because you owe $18,000 to men who do not send invoices when a debt goes unpaid." The table had gone completely silent in a way that felt almost physical, the kind of silence where you can hear the refrigerator humming in the next room. Kelsey's face had gone white, her eyes moving rapidly between me and her father, and I understood in that moment that she had genuinely not known, that whatever soft landings Gary had given her over the years, he had never told her where the money underneath them was actually coming from. Gary tried to recover, the way people always try to recover once the first piece of proof lands on the table, his voice climbing into something defensive and wounded all at once. "You don't understand," he said, his hands gripping the edge of the table now. "I was drowning, Renee. I didn't know what else to do. Your mother would understand. She would want me to be okay. She wouldn't want you doing this to me in front of everyone." I felt something in my chest go very still, and very steady at that, the same stillness I feel in the middle of any investigation when a person finally says the thing that confirms every single fact I already have in front of me. "She told me the jewelry was mine 3 days before she died," I said, still not raising my voice, "and I want everyone at this table to understand that clearly. It's written in her will. It was never yours to sell, Gary. Not legally and not morally, no matter how much you were drowning." I pulled the second document out, the printed copy of the will with the clause highlighted in yellow, and set it beside the pawn shop photograph. And then I set a third document down, the one Marcus had drafted, laying out in plain, factual language exactly who Gary owed money to, and exactly how that debt had accumulated over the 2 years following my mother's death. Sherry's husband exhaled audibly. Melissa's boyfriend suddenly found something extremely interesting to look at on his phone. Kelsey turned to her father and asked, in a small, broken voice I had never heard her use before, "Is that true, Dad? Is any of that true?" Gary did not answer her. He simply sat there with his hands still gripping the edge of the table, staring down at the photograph of his own signature, and the silence that followed was more damning than anything I could have said. I told him then, calmly, that I had already spoken with a detective about the pawn transaction and about the debt itself, and that depending on how he chose to handle the next several weeks, he was looking at either a very quiet restitution arrangement or a very public criminal complaint for theft of estate property. The choice, I told him, was entirely his, but the folder in front of him now belonged to more people than just me. Sherry spoke up then for the first time all evening, her voice shaking slightly but clear, telling Gary that he was welcome to leave her house tonight, but that he was not welcome to keep pretending. Not at her table, not on the anniversary of her sister's death, not for one more year. Gary stood up slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor in the quiet room, and he looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between anger and something close to shame, and he said only one thing before he walked out of that dining room and out of Sherry's front door into the cold March night. "I loved her," he said. "That's the part none of you seem to want to remember." I let him say it, because I understood, even in that moment, that both things could be true at once. That a man could have loved my mother deeply and still, years later, chosen his own desperation over the last true promise he ever made to her. The weeks after that dinner unfolded more slowly than I expected, the way real consequences almost always do, compared to the neat, fast justice you see in movies. Gary did not go to jail, and I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters for you to understand how this actually resolved, rather than how a more dramatic version of this story might have ended. Marcus helped me file a formal claim against Gary's portion of the estate, using the documentation we had built, the appraisal, the will, the pawnshop ledger, and the detective I had spoken with, confirmed that while a criminal theft charge was absolutely on the table, most cases like this one, involving family and an estate rather than a stranger, tend to move toward restitution if the person responsible cooperates. Gary, faced with the very real threat of a criminal complaint and the total collapse of what little family standing he had left, chose to cooperate. Within 3 weeks, his attorney contacted mine with an agreement to pay full restitution for the appraised value of the jewelry, $7,400, structured as a series of payments pulled directly from the sale of a small rental property he and my mother had once owned together. The same property, I later learned, that he had been quietly trying to refinance around for months before any of this ever came to light. The house on Ashford Street went up for sale that same spring. Gary could not afford to keep it once the restitution payments began, and once the underlying debt to the men from that private card game finally came due in full. A debt I later learned he settled by selling off most of his contracting equipment and taking out a personal loan that will keep him paying interest well into his 70s. He moved into a small apartment 2 towns over, and the extended family, the same family that had gathered every year at Sherry's table to hear his cinnamon roll story, quietly and without any single dramatic announcement, stopped inviting him to things. Kelsey, to her credit, did not disappear the way I half expected her to. She called me about a month after the dinner, crying on the phone, apologizing for things that were never actually hers to apologize for, and telling me that she had confronted her father directly about where all those soft landings over the years had actually come from. She told me he admitted, finally, that some of the money he had given her had indeed come from loans he never intended to repay. Honestly, money borrowed against a house that was never fully his to borrow against. Kelsey and I are not close, not the way sisters are supposed to be, but we talk now, carefully, the way 2 people do when they are both still sorting through the wreckage of the same man's choices from very different angles. I used part of the restitution money, once it finally came through in full about 5 months after that dinner, to have the pearls and the emerald bracelet formally traced and, where possible, repurchased. The pearls, it turned out, had been sold to a private jewelry buyer who had already resold them to a collector 2 states away, and after some careful, patient negotiation on Marcus's part, I was able to buy them back for a price that felt, honestly, like more money than they were worth on paper, but far less than what they were actually worth to me. The emerald and gold bracelet, the one my mother bought with her own hands the year her bakery finally turned a profit, was harder to find, and I have made peace with the possibility that I may never see that particular piece again. What I do have, sitting now in a small wooden box on my own dresser, is the wedding ring I bought back for $210 on a quiet Saturday afternoon, and the pearls that crossed an ocean sewn into the lining of a coat before they ever touched my grandmother's neck, and I understand now that those 2 pieces alone are enough to carry everything forward that my mother ever meant for me to carry. I put those pearls around Willow's neck for her 5th birthday photographs, almost exactly 1 year after everything came apart in Sherry's dining room, standing in front of that same hallway mirror, in a house that is no longer Gary's, no longer even standing on Ashford Street at all, but in my own home 2 hours away, where my mother's memory now lives in a place nobody can quietly sell out from under it. Willow does not understand yet what those pearls actually mean. Not fully, not the way I do, but I have started telling her small pieces of the story, the way my own mother told me small pieces of her own history over the years. A little at a time, patiently, the way you build trust in a child the same way you build a case, one honest fact laid carefully after another. I think about Gary sometimes, more than I expected I would after everything settled. I do not hate him, though I understand completely why some people in my family do. I think he loved my mother the way a genuinely broken man is capable of loving someone, imperfectly, generously in the moments that mattered least, and catastrophically absent in the moment that mattered most. I think grief and desperation are 2 of the most dangerous forces a human being can carry at the same time, and I think Gary let both of those forces decide for him that he will spend the rest of his life trying to explain away, to himself if to no one else. What I know for certain, sitting here now, with my mother's ring on a chain around my own neck and her pearls waiting in a drawer, for the day Willow is old enough to understand exactly what they cost to protect, is that what someone steals from you can never actually erase what someone gave you. Diane Kowalski gave me a mother who built something out of nothing with her own 2 hands, and no debt, no pawnshop ledger, and no man's desperation was ever going to be allowed to take that away from me twice. If this story meant something to you, if you have ever had to protect the memory of someone you loved from a person who was supposed to protect it alongside you, I want to hear about it, so please share your story in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, tell me what time it is where you are, and if this is the kind of story that stays with you, the way it has stayed with me, please subscribe, because there are more stories like this one still waiting to be told, and I promise you, every single one of them is worth staying until the very end for.